this term emerged during the period of slavery, and when African people were taken as slaves in Africa and brought to first America, and the term emerged Negroes, and even before that, the Portuguese were involved in slavery, using the term or misusing the term Negroes. Ravi Dev had an excellent article today. Before I call upon him to give a background about that term, I will ask Professor Beto Ramrak to give his point of view on the emergence of the term Negroes and Coolies. Coolies, of course, refers to Indians, and at one point in time Chinese as well, who were brought to the Caribbean as indentured labor. Coolies for Chinese was also used in the United States when they were brought to build the railway stations and to engage in other kind of what one can refer to as semi-slave labor. Professor Ramrak, you want to give a little history of the term Negroes and Coolie?
All right, that's okay. That will require some a level of I guess intense explanation, which we probably don't have time for. But in brief, let me just say for us before we get there, one of the things we try to do with a show like this, and people may be seeing other people joining us in the discussion today, this is an opportunity here for us to discuss how these issues affect us. When I say us, I'm referring to Indians, right? So we don't want to sound arrogant or as if we know everything. We don't. But hopefully with this kind of discussion, we can encourage other discussion, but we're sharing what we know. And again, we're not the brightest people in the world, but these are issues that affect us, and we take this opportunity here today with these kinds of shows to address our own concern, meaning the concerns of Indians. So I do want to make a distinction. When I say Indian or Guyanese, it's two different conception, right? I'll get to the Negroes in a minute. When we say Guyanese, we're referring to what is really a legal definition of who we are. We live in Guyana, we're born there, by blood or by being born in that territory. We're Guyanese. And sometimes that can create some confusion because when we say we're Indian or we're Black or we're African, that creates some kind of contradiction in people's minds, right? And I can give you an example, where sometimes even Indians tend to be uncomfortable when it comes to defining themselves in terms of who they are as citizens and as Indians or people of Indian origin and so on. I can point to one example, 2015, when Moses Nagamutu came to New York. He was campaigning, with Ranger and so on. And there was a question asked to him about whether he was Indian or not. And Moses took time to point out to the audience that he was invited to India, again, India, the land of his ancestors, right? Where he said when he received the award that they give him, he made it a point to say, I am not Indian, I am Guyanese. So there's a lot of confusion about that term. So in a nutshell, I'm saying, when I say I'm Indian, I'm referring to the cultural background, the historical experience we share. Similarly, when Blacks would say, well, I'm African, there's a specific history, right? Specific culture and so on that goes with those definitions. But to come back to your term, the use of Negro, that's a discussion that Black folks have been having. If you've seen the last show with David Hines, they've dealt a lot with that. But here tonight, we want to focus on the whole notion of names and how those names, can affect us as Indians. The controversy, I think, came out of a situation where Kedaki Amsterdam was arrested, and in the police report, it described him as Negro, right? And then the cabinet, had a discussion on this, I guess, and they said, okay, we're not going to use that term anymore. From where I'm standing, this should have been a term that you don't use because there is a history here that's connected. There's a much worse term, which is, you know, what they call the N word, which is a sort of a pejorative word. It has a history, right? And when you use that N word, you know, people will go up in arms, right? Rightfully so, because there's a history there. It's a negative connotation, and it has a lot to do with historical origin and so on. But we don't use the N word in that sense as they would use it, let's say, some people in the United States. But the word Negro, you know, they both have, in terms of etymology, in terms of the root, they share the same, you know, common connection. So the word Negro, why it has been historically rejected is because it implies that, you know, you're referring to a person who is black, and black is connected to anything that is negative. So therefore that word was thrown out. And I remember many years ago when people like Jesse Jackson, his son, just visited Guyana, when they try to make the argument that, look, you know, African folks in the United States should define themselves as African Americans, right? Meaning that he's saying, look, we're citizens, we're Americans, but we're also Africans. So therefore you have terms like Italian Americans, you know, Chinese Americans, and so on. So we need to understand what those two terms really mean, right? So yes, this was the right thing to do. It should have been done a long time ago, regardless of who was using it, and you know, and the reason why it continued to be used. So that was the right thing to do. Now, if you want me to talk about the other side of this, we can do that, but I don't want to dominate your show. I want
so yeah, let's hear a little from Ravi. But before Ravi come on, just again to give a further clarification of background, you were talking about Kidaki Amsterdam, who was arrested, and the police filed a report. And in those kind of reports, one has to give the ethnic or racial description of the person. And so historically, the term Negro has been used since time of slavery to now to describe people of African descent. The term Coolie was never used to describe people of East Indian or Chinese descent when they were arrested for crimes. So the lawyers, Mr. Nigel Hughes, among others, and community leaders felt this term Negro should be done away with, and it has made news. As I indicated, the term Coolie was used to describe people of Indian descent who were brought as indentured laborers, and even before they were brought as indentured laborers, Indians were traded as slaves. You are familiar with the name Yale, after whom the University Yale was named. Mr. Yale was involved in the trading of Indian as well as African slaves, not indentured labor, slaves. And Indian slaves were traded to several territories. Indian slaves were also taken by the French to what was then French Reunion. In fact, it's still French Reunion Island. So Reunion Island had both Indian slaves as well as Indian indentured laborers. As I indicated earlier, Ravi wrote an excellent piece today in the, I think it was in the Kaiju News. And I'll ask Ravi to elaborate on that and any further information he may have on the usage of the term Coolie and Negroes.
Thank you, Dr. Bisram. Well, I entered the fray, so to speak, because I think there needs to be some clarification. You know, in our text, the Rig Veda, we divide them into the Shukla versions. Those where Shukla means light, simply meaning that they are very well organized and delineated. And then we have the Krishna recensions, which are, we say, dark, which is basically they're simply confused and maybe a little of a mishmash, not well organized. So hopefully I'll be shining some light on this topic, or I want to come back to that. Human beings are human beings, and of course we've been living on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years. The point, this whole brouhaha began when Portugal started to take people from Africa into Europe. People don't remember that the Portuguese first took people from Africa into Europe and enslaved them. And later, when they quote unquote discovered the New World, the people they found over here, the indigenous peoples they found over here, couldn't take that kind of labor regimen, and they brought these people from Africa. Let's call them Africans. However, to justify them enslaving these people, they attributed certain qualities to them simply based on how they looked. And the most dominant feature was their skin color, because that was the biggest physical difference between them and the Europeans. So the important thing is not just the name Negro, which simply means black in Portuguese and Spanish, because here again, today we're hearing people don't mind being called black, but all it means, Negro simply means black. But the point is what meaning, what significance, what connotations were given by that name. And what the whites did was to say that these people, these human beings, were not actually human beings. They were subhuman. From a Christian theological standpoint, they claim these people don't really have souls. So for us to enslave them and let them work amongst us, we are doing them a favor by enslaving them. And that was the whole point. So it is this justification which since 1500s became normalized. So when a person of African descent objects to the term Negro, yet uses the word black, which at a certain level means the same thing, they're not really objecting to the word, but the connotation of the word. So Negro connotes that vision of definition of people from Africa as being subhuman. And that is what they resent and reject totally, and we all should also. So coming back to how the term changed, I remember as a boy that Negro was still being used in Guyana by blacks. In fact, people think that this whole hostility between Indians and Africans in Guyana began with Jagan and Burnham. No. Before that, there was an East Indian Association founded in 1916 and renewed in 1990. And then there was a Negro Progress Convention. So when Africans in Guyana asserted themselves to say, hey, to use Jesse Jackson's term, we are somebody, they used the term Negro without any flinching or cringing or anything like that. So that petered out. And then we had a new term, colored people. We had the League of Colored People, right? You had John Carter. Even Burnham was a member of the League of Colored People when he was in London, because it was seen as a more less offensive term than blacks. Then, of course, Black Power came in the 60s in America, and you had the term blacks. So we have had a fight for definition of self, that we should be we should define ourselves in our own terms and by our own terms. And I come back to the point that Dr. Rambrack is making, that in this area of human endeavor, we, the people of Indian origin, have been rather careless about how people define us. And it's like, okay, call me what you want. It doesn't matter. It does matter. And we'll come to it in greater detail. But when people call you a Coolie, just like how when you call somebody a Negro, there are connotations to that. and we can explore that at some point upon your direction. But we have to, as the subject says, we have to interrogate these terms and ask, well, how is it being used? What baggage is it taking? And should we simply accept it or should we reject it also?
Excellent. So connotation is very, very important, Dr. Ramrak. Any further clarification?
No, I think that, says a lot about the use of words. I mean, even within our own family, we're careful about the kind of words we use and how we refer to people, right? So it starts from there. But I want to jump back to, what we started out by saying, that, the idea that there's also another word we have to confront, which is Coolie. And I want to say a few things about that. The word itself, it goes back to, Southern India. In Tamil, it was spelled Kuli. So if you were to go to India today, people would still use that word, right? You would hear people calling people who, put their luggage on the back and they load it onto the train in Calcutta and so on. So these were like wage laborers, right? People who were working, doing manual labor. So that term came into being. But we have to understand, again, the historical context of how it was used when we define that term and how we try to make it, connected to our history. The word Coolie was used in Guyana in a different connotation. It referred to, Indians who were indentured laborers, and there were a certain connotation that went with that, just as how the word, Negro has a certain connotation, a historical connotation. And I'll give you an example of what somebody had written, just to kind of show you how the colonial experience has really changed that concept, right? So it became a very pejorative word, a word that described Indians in the most demeaning kind of way. There was a fella by the name of, the name is Henry Dalton, right? And he had written a book on the history of British Guyana, actually 2 volumes, right? And I'll share with you some of the language. Now, this is a medical doctor, right, who was in British Guyana and saw Indians coming into Guyana after 1838. So in the 1840s, he's writing, again, a medical doctor. These are some of the words he used: indolent, dirty, vagrant in their habits, beggars in tongue, scavengers of society, clothed scantily in the filthiest rags, their bodies rendered often disgusting by diseases of the skin arising from want of cleanliness. They prowled about the streets and country, picking up for food putrid bodies of dead animals. And it goes on, right? So my point here is that the concept of Coolie has transformed to an application of those people who are now indentured workers. It has that very negative connotation. And even when, over time, Indians, these so-called hill coolies, as Gladstone referred to them, even as they begin to move up in their ranks in society, if you fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, here's another, I guess you can say this is a more refined perspective of the Indians, these so-called coolies. So this was in 1963. A popular novelist, Edgar Mittelholzer, he grew up in Amsterdam, right, not too far from where I went to school, in Coburg Street, where the Lecours and the Romans and so on lived. So Mittelholzer interacted with these people who were prominent, lawyers and so on. But these are his words. He says, and I'll quote, "Coolies, we call them, whether they were laborers or eventually became doctors or barristers or civil servants." So my point is that concept, that pejorative concept, stuck with Indians. So when Indians use the term Coolies, it conjures up all of those images. Now, there are some people who will say to you, well, we have been called Coolies, for so many years. It's okay to use the term. But again, that's, to me, is a point of ignorance, a misunderstanding of the concept. Now, I have to add also that there are people today, intelligent people among us, who try to, in a sense, embrace this concept, the Coolie concept, right, and try to give it a human face. And I'm talking about a whole body of literature that exists out there in what is called Coolitude. They've copied the term negritude, which has to do with the movement among Blacks in the 1900s, which was designed, to bring pride to Africans around the world. So we had this imitation, right? So you have that attempt. And one of the things that I can tell you is, even within my family, the word was always used, not just among Indians, but others. But we never, make it a point to stand up and say, well, that's not a term, we want to use. Just like how Africans would say, well, we don't want to be called the N-word, or we don't want to be called Negroes, right? There's a history to that. But we also have a book called, Coolie Woman. So again, that's used in context. But the point is, we have to have that understanding that that term connotates a negative, historical experience, and it should not be used. So then the logical question is, how do we call ourselves, right? They are, in the literature, there are people who have used the terms like Indo-Guyanese, right? Indo-Caribbean people. That's a term that people like Frank Birbal Singh has used, but those terms create a hyphenated Indian, right? It makes it seem like we're passing through Guyana. There was a fellow named Leo Desprez, an anthropologist, who did a study in 1967 in Guyana. He looked at race relations. He referred to Africans as Afro-Guyanese, but he referred to Indians as East Indians. Now, again, there's an implication here. We have a problem with the use of Coolie. We're not using that anymore, right? We're no longer the Hill Coolies, but here we are, we're being called people of East Indian background. In other words, that term by itself implies that we are still in transition. Afro-Guyanese implies that you're African and you're Guyanese. If you're saying we're East Indians, it means we're people of the East who Columbus was looking for, right? So therefore, we don't have a permanent, fixture in Guyana. So we are smarter than those people, right? We've gone through a phase, a process, just like how Africans have gone through that historical experience, and they've changed the definition of who they are. We have to do the same thing. I would prefer the word Indian Guyanese, or it's simply Indians. And I think the best way to figure out how people should define themselves if you're Indians is to ask Indians that question. How do you define yourself? And I am wagering a bet that most folks in Guyana, in Trinidad, and so on, will say, I am an Indian, right? And I think that is what is called a self-affirmation of who you are. And I think we have to be able to understand the historical baggage that came with that, right? We have to understand that, we're no longer, those people who you used to call the Hill Coolies, who work in the plantation, or the scavengers who used to hang out in Georgetown begging for food, right? We are a people who have progressed along the way, like every other people in Guyana. So that is what I would say about that concept. And I think we have to be conscious about that historical fact. And I would say one last thing, for Indians who may be listening to what we're seeing here, when you hear people use that term, you should be able to correct them. And if not correct them, at least give them a little historical background of where that term came from and how it's been used to describe us as people, right?
Yeah, I like to get back to that point a bit later on. You're asking people to correct the usage of the term and stop using coolies, but many people don't really know their history. So I'd like for you to talk a little about that later on. But before I do that, I just want to point of information throughout the Caribbean, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Trinidad, Indians are referred to and often called Coolie. Look at that Coolie boy over there. Coolie, come over here. Jamaica, and very, very commonly used in Jamaica as well, in a very derogatory, pejorative way. And so that also people should also understand. And secondly, you talk about how Indians were seen, or these coolies were seen as scavengers in Georgetown and elsewhere. But one must always remember that it was the British, the imperial powers, who rendered the indentured laborers, the Indians, as scavengers and as homeless and depraved people. Had it not been for their involvement in this semi-slavery labor, Indians would have remained in India, I suppose, or probably lived a much better life if they were given the freedom that came 100 years after indentureship. Ravidev?
Well, I think this is how our people need to know their own history. And to me, one of the most disappointing aspects of interacting with fellow Indians is that they don't actually know their history. And that is not by accident. I did, when I was a boy back in Guyana, young man, did West Indian history. And I think the textbook was Perry and Sherlock. And it had maybe just about 4 or 5 pages on the Indians in the Caribbean. You're talking of West Indian history. And all of the rest was about African West Indians. Now, you could say, well, the Africans outnumber us, but overall, we are at least 20% of the British Caribbean. And in Trinidad, Suriname, and Guyana, we are a plurality. Yet, very, very short shrift was given to us. And as you go through school, whether you're told directly or you pick it up, that only things that are important are written about and are worthy of mention and of analysis. And therefore, when that boy leaves school, he is left to assume, well, the East Indians somehow are not very important. They are peripheral. And that vision remains. So I would like to say 2 things. One, to go before that India was a place that everyone wanted to go to in that early Europe, when the Portuguese were inching their way behind Africa, and finally Vasco da Gama would, go under by the horn and go to. And they were seeking India. Africa was seen as a black space there, blank space, sorry. And they were going to India. Why? Because India was of fabulous wealth in their imagination, because the land route across Asia through the Muslim countries brought spices and fineries like silk and other things to India. So India was very wealthy. We now know that at that juncture, India was like China is today. India had about 20% of the world trade. But yet, when it was conquered by the British devastated India, destroyed it. And to use a term from the 70s that Dr. Walter Rodney used, it underdeveloped India, meaning that the industries that India had were destroyed. Take, for example, the cotton industry. India practically gave cotton to the world. Our muslin was so fine that you could pass it through a finger ring. It was so finely woven, impossible for the West to replicate. Yet, India weaving was banned. They literally cut out the thumbs of those weavers to prevent them from weaving by hand, and then of course developed machines, and the cotton industry of Lancashire were invented. So India now became, not only they couldn't manufacture cloth because of what the British did, the British then had places like Guyana and America produce cotton and brought the cotton from there. So India then, that is how you get underdeveloped. So by the time the 1800s roll around, you have millions and millions of Indians who had been occupied before are now roaming India, looking for work, looking to survive. And not only that, for example, where my great grandfather came from, near Patna, they had to then grow poppy to make opium because the British were so crude. You're talking about drug dealing. They literally had these farmers quit whatever they were planting to subsist and live, and then plant poppy for them to make opium where they could exchange with Chinese and get their tea. So to make a long story short, India was destroyed. And so when we hear today, and I hear it on these same talk shows in Guyana, when Coolie people come, they were starving in India, and they come here and they get, sure, they were starving in India, but it was something, it's like as if somebody burnt your house down and then they tell you, well, you must jump out. Of course you have to jump out if you want to survive. It's a human instinct. So the first thing I want to make is that Indians or people of Indian descent should understand that history, that the glory that was India, as I think Professor Basham wrote, was destroyed by India. So even though they call it the jewel in the crown, right? It had been destroyed by them for what it was. The second thing, when we were brought to the Caribbean as Coolies, they took that name, and just like they did with Negro, they gave it particular meaning. So whether you were well-read, whether you take, for example, my people, I'm of Kurmi descent. Kurmis from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, are farming people. They are seen as the farmers par excellence. Nitish Kumar, Chief Minister of Bihar, is Kurmi, is my guy. The point is, though, that when my great-grandfather came, they saw him as a coolie, and they defined him as a coolie because he had to cut cane and do whatever they wanted on the sugar estate. But they forget and pretend to forget he came from an agricultural society that was 5,000 years old. And so they had their own engineering background. A simple man from a village, my great grandfather, because I saw it in my own father. We had a farm that I had to go with him. That when you plant rice, they knew, even though in the 1800s and early 1900s, the government of Guyana tried to set up a rice milling operation and are planting rice. It took the Indians, because rice is a precise crop, when you must have water, to what height, to what level. You must know when to cut it, when to reap it, how to trash it, how to mill it. It's a technical process. But those people were never given credit. So somehow today you hear about those describing those same people as ignorant coolies. Yet today their industry is surviving and is thriving and will feed the Caribbean and has fed the Caribbean and all of the rest of Guyana for over 100 years. Yet they're not given any credit for that because they brought that skill with them. They were trained, skilled people. The people who started the goldsmithing operations in our country, that's all of Indian descent. In all these different trades that they brought, they were people that came with knowledge, yet they were all lumped as coolies, and as Dr. Dalton described us, because that was how they had us. And so they took our willingness to save, to buy land, as somehow to call it being means. So today, as Dr. Ramarak is saying, a lot of Indians have internalized these values. And for example, when my kids first went to Queens, both to Queens, and we're talking in the in the early 2000s now, they're going to Queens. The kids around them didn't see eating dal and rice and bhaji as something they should admit to. You know, I used to look at these beauty queens when they're called. What's your favorite food? Oh, lau mein and fried rice. Nobody would ever say that I like to sani, dal and rice and bhaji. Mind you, it's one of the most balanced dishes around. You get me? The dal gave you protein, the rice gave you carbohydrates, the bhaji gave you vegetable. It was a scientific diet. And every Indian home had to have that pot of dal and rice and bhaji at the very minimum. So I want to say this, come back to that. We have to get to understand what is behind the meaning of the word coolie, why they were able to impose it on us, and why we must now throw it back and take a label that is to our satisfaction.
Okay, so just to add some more clarity and clarification on some of the history that Ravi mentioned, the invaluable role that Kurmi farmers, and there are some other farming castes as well, including the Guerreros who were involved in horticulture, mining cows and horses and so forth. The Kurmi practically.
I wish I'm
Hello?
gonna tell you a Globespan program. What was that again? I took off my camera.
The Kurmis were the finest farmers in Bihar and in Uttar Pradesh. When the British were talking about famine in India, they were not talking about how they were redirecting the grains from India towards Europe, towards Britain, rather than to feed the people of then British India. The second point I wish to make is that when Ravi talks about the productivity of Indians in the Caribbean, it was George Lamming who wrote one of the most renowned classical novels called In the Castle of My Skin and other books. And Lamming made it very, very clear that Indians were among the most industrious people in the Caribbean. In fact, he pointed out that they fed us meaning Africans and other groups in the Caribbean region.
These were the hands that fed us.
Yes. So we must not forget that Indians have made very, very important contributions, and they should not be seen as foreigners, as some of us are often labeled as these useless coolies and who are happy to leave India. Indians have developed Europe. In fact, it was through the underdevelopment of India that Europe became developed. Bitram Ramrak.
$45 trillion was looted.
On one other point, Ravi did mention about the 20%. India, when the British came, India had accounted for 25% of global GDP. When the British left, it was only 3%. And today, I think it has gone up to about 10%. So certainly, India has made great strides before the British came and after the British left.
Right. Yeah, we don't hear about those things because somehow, well, as Ravi is saying, it's not in the curriculum and we're being trained, or being told, focus on Guyana, forget about your past, forget about your connection with India and so on. So that, again, that's part of the history that has to be corrected. But a couple of quick points here. One, we started out talking about, Negroes and what Kadaki Amsterdam had said. I do want to point out that he had used the word Coolies many times before on his show, which I had seen. And nobody who's connected with him has sought to correct him on that. Secondly, I want to give you another example of how, the leadership we have, can create even more confusion when it comes to addressing who we are, not as Coolies, but as Indians. In 1957, Eric Williams sent one of his ministers, he may have been the Minister of Health, I'm not sure, a fellow by the name of Dr. Winston Mahabir, right? So he was meeting with Nehru and they were walking through the gardens and so on. And they're talking about, world problems and Trinidad and so on. And Nehru found it puzzling that this chap looked Indian, but he's not even talking about his connection with India or his Indian background. So finally, And Nehru became impatient. He stopped walking, turned to him, Dr. Mahavir, and says, "You're Indian, aren't you?" Now, Dr. Mahavir snapped back as if he was ready with a response, and he says, "No, I am West Indian." That was the term he used. Now, many years later, now you can imagine, Nehru must have been very confused. But Winston Mahavir did, he apologized for that, and he realized his faux pas, right? But the point is, again, that's a misunderstanding of history. You would never hear a fellow like, Walter Rodney say, "I am Guyanese," and leave it at that. He would continue by saying, "I am African, I am from the Caribbean, I'm connected with Africa." So he understood all those nuances that define him, right? So we have to be able to look at all of those. It's like, brainstorming. There's a circle, and you see all those connections, right, with your historical past. And that connection with India also has to be there. Other things I want to point out, which is that even though it seems like a lot of people don't interrogate the use of the word Coolie, I do have to point out that in Jamaica, I don't have all the details with me in terms of the name of the person, but there was an Indian organization that did pass a resolution and asked the government to disband the use of Coolie because of all of the historical baggage and connotation that it brought to the image of being Indian. Secondly, we talked about the British Guiana East Indian Association. Ravi, we can't hear you. You're muted.
It was officially banned.
Yeah, and then in Guyana, the British Guiana East Indian Association, which was the premier organization that represented Indians, as Ravi says, started in 1916 in Berbice. They had also addressed that issue, and they did ask the government, or they did say that we should not be using those terms. So the history is there, and if we understand that history, then we would know that for those people who came before us, they made mistakes, but some of them recognize the problem, of continuing to use those connotations. And it comes back to who we are. We're smarter today. We have to take charge of our own history and write about our history and look at some of the things, that people have said in the past. So the Europeans were the ones colonizing us. They use those terms. Gladstone, the fellow who started indentureship, he used the word hill coolies, right? So those historical terms are there. So we have to, in a sense, self-affirm ourselves. In a sense, a kind of movement that Africans were experiencing in the 50s and 60s in terms of, bringing pride and talking about who you are as a human being. That doesn't make you anti-Guyanese. It makes you a person who understands your history. So you can be a citizen, you can be a Guyanese, but you can also be a person who appreciate your historical background in a positive way, right? And as cultural people in Ghana, we learn from each other, we borrow and steal from each other's culture. And that's the way it should be.
Speaking about knowing one's history, I remember I studied West Indian history for GCE. And we used to look back at papers that were offered from University of London, Cambridge, Oxford. I don't recall ever seeing a question on indentureship. And for CXC, I do not know if there is any question at CXC on Indian indentureship. But I was looking through the syllabus, and I saw Portuguese indentureship, I saw Chinese indentureship, and hardly any mention of Indian indentureship. Ravi, anything to add to what Bertram Ramarak said?
Well, I think we're stressing the point. They say sticks and stones. We learned in nursery school, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But words hurt the worse, because when those words carry certain meanings and they are hurled at you, they can hurt you once that individual has the capacity to do so. I remember a little run-in I had with President Granger. A member of his staff, it came out over Facebook that she was writing, and she said, well, one of her own, meaning she was an African of African descent, had worked in the ERC of all places before going to Granger's office as a press officer, and says, "Well, one of so and so is in here friendsing with me," while she doesn't know that those Coolie people in the office are undercutting her to me, meaning, so she was attributing this whole notion of deviousness to Coolie, which is one of the stereotypes. If you read Indian history in Guyana, where the British didn't give any credibility of a Coolie, as they call him, to give evidence in his own defense, because he was said to be congenitally a liar. How could he dare speak the truth? He couldn't, and that has come down. So other people will still, when they talk of you, them Coolie people, you know, they assume that part of one of the stereotype is of this deviousness. The other thing would be as if when you are thrifty, they say you are mean. So the quality, we came as economic immigrants to improve your lot. So you came to make money, to work as hard, not to spend, defer your gratification because you wanted to save and hopefully go back to India or invest right in Guyana, which we did. But rather than seeing that as a positive quality, it was derided as a set of mean people. And today, our young people are reacting to that so-called curse, and they want to be as flagrant in their spending habits as anybody else. So what I have called about that all of the abominations of Creole culture, which kept African Guyanese in a place of being always imprisoned by what they were taught. Those Indian Guyanese, in being so-called educated, are adopting those same practices, which will then ensure that they can never get out and would remain trapped. And one of it is the same habit of spending. I grew up with my nanny, who was born in 1900. My nana was born in 1896. And they taught me that if you earn $1, you never, ever would spend $1. To spend 80 cents would be extravagant. The point, of course, that even if you have to spend 80 cents, you have to live within that 80 cents because you're putting aside something for a rainy day. Now, there are fancy terms now of deferred gratification. So when people want to know, well, how come these Indians were able to earn to buy all these rice lands? How come they were able to do all these things? It was because they were able to defer their gratification and they were able to then invest. The other thing is that where the word Coolie is that because for the longest while we focused on working and saving money, and also because we did not want to be converted into Christianity, we kept away from schools, and therefore we got the label that we were not educated. So even today you will hear people of other races talking about them being educated, and the implicit statement is that somehow these Coolies, as they think in their mind, like Granger's secretary did, are not as educated as them because they don't educate. Well, what is education? I want to give an example which I like to. In the development of rice, there was an individual who bought land in Maikoni, right? And his name was Jagdeo, no relation to vice president, but his name was Jagdeo. And Jagdeo ended up with over 6,000 acres of rice. Jagdeo had the first combine, the first tractor that was imported into Guyana. Jagdeo dug a whole, I forget how many miles canal, the Jagdeo Canal, that still stand there to irrigate. He bought his own rice mill. He then bought his own boat to bring the rice out to the coast because he was all the way deep in Maikoni. And you know what? He could not read nor write, and therefore not being literate, he could not even vote. So they said to vote, you must understand how to run a country. So he could run a 6,000 acre rice, industry, and yet he could not vote because he could not. So it comes back again us knowing all these factors and do not become embarrassed about it being an Indian. You have to embrace that Indianness because it has served us well. It is not by fortuity that we have progressed wherever we have come. It is by some of the values that came with us, even though we were derided, as Dr. Dalton did in that statement Beto read.
On, on literacy and education, there were many Indians who were very, very talented and who were artisan, semi-skilled engineers, or even proper engineers. And there were many who were literate in their own native language when they came, Hindi or even in Bhojpuri. And yet they were described as being illiterate.
Yes.
So we have focused enough on the description of the Coolies and the Negroes. I wonder if you could talk a little now about memory warriors. Dr. Ramrick, you want to give a little background on that?
Well, I'm going to try and give a little bit of background on this because I had written something. And again, it has to do with understanding our history. And I made the point that the Europeans, give us certain names, describe us in a certain way. And of course, we don't have the education infrastructure set up in a way that educate us about our history. So we've talked about those two things. And I think the notion of memory warriors came about. I know Ravi has written about this too, because I had mentioned in that letter that I wrote, apparently, Henry Jeffrey missed that point. So he took offense to me, labeling him a memory warrior. So if, Henry Jeffrey is watching this show tonight, I want to give him my definition of what I meant when I use that term, right? And I think it's important for us to understand because when we talk about these things on these shows and we use these kinds of words and language, I think it's important for people to understand what those concepts and those words really mean from where, we're coming from. My mother always used to say, look at the other side and so you can understand the big picture. So take your little feet and put it in the big shoes of the other person so you can see all sides. I don't think Jeffrey did that. So I want to give you my definition. And again, this is for Henry Jeffrey, if he's watching, of what I meant when I use that word memory warrior, right? Because I looked at the show that he did with David Hines, and I made some quick notes. So I'm just going to belt them out very quickly. A memory warrior essentially looks at things from a specific perspective. So one, memory warriors use history as a weapon. So when you look at the shows, and again, all the shows that Henry Jeffrey has been on, with David Hines and Rickford Burke and Rhonda Lane and all of these people, they share a similar mindset. By the way, I'll come back to Henry Jeffrey in a minute. So that's one. They use history as a weapon. In other words, there is always that reference to the fact that Africans came first. There's that prior arrival, right? They suffered more in Guyana. So therefore, they should get that bigger piece of the pie. That's the first thing. Secondly, in my mind, when I use that concept, memory warriors are being historically selective, right? And here's an example of what I mean by that. They can talk about the fact that, Kadaki Amsterdam was being persecuted, he was put in shackles and so on, or whatever, but right? But the point is this, they will not talk about the fact that this is a guy who allowed a person to call in his show to behead the four most prominent, I would say, Indian politicians in Guyana. So that fact seemed to have disappeared in the narrative. It's all about, a member of the WPA being persecuted. Third, these memory warriors believe that first you must seek ye the political kingdom and everything shall come after that. Remember what happened 2020, right? David wanted to have a new election with Granger in charge and a power sharing arrangement with Granger being the king of that kingdom, right? He destroyed the ballot boxes and started everything new, right? So they believe that politics is about everything. They don't believe in sharing power when they are in office, right? Four, when you look at the narrative that these memory warriors are projecting, they're essentially making the argument that the European state that we have been talking about, the plantocracy, is in a sense similar to the current state slash government in Guyana. Therefore, when you look at the arguments they make, everything that the Europeans did to African Guyanese is now transferred to this current regime in Guyana. And they're making the argument that this government is like that colonial government that is doing every single thing that is negative, that is wrong to our African Guyanese, right? So you have that. And here's the other thing to this argument, and we've had this discussion before. If you're saying that this government, which is an independent state, is the same, they can now make the argument that they are due reparations. Nobody has any problem with that. But they're making the argument, okay, that the Gladstones and everyone else, plantocracy, should give reparations, fair enough. But now they're also making the argument that the current state of Guyana must give reparations to Africans because it is a state and is the same state that existed in the past. So that means they're not taking into consideration that, let's say, the oil resources should be distributed equitably. They're saying that can happen after they get reparations from this current government. And I've made the argument that that is double dipping. The other thing that they're doing, Richard, and we've talked about this, Ravi and myself, is by focusing on those elements in their narrative, they are essentially, and you don't have to buy my words for this, look at the shows that they have, Politics 101, and look at Ben Chap, look at Rickford Burke, look at the shows that they have. There is always that denial or attempt to deny the narrative of the other side. In other words, their narrative, their historical experience is the most important. So forget about the Amerindians, forget about their experience. Sometimes they mention them in passing, but the narrative does not include what we call a national narrative to examine the experience of everyone in Guyana so you can move the entire country ahead. The other thing about these memory warriors, which they constantly do, is their focus is on race, race, race. It's the same mindset when you look at what Henry Jeffrey would be talking about, or David Hines, right? Rickford Burke, all of these folks share a similar mindset. It's like a groupthink, right? Race is the dominant issue. This current regime has done nothing positive, right? And therefore, you have to have a restructuring of the entire political system. And this is the last point I want to make, and I hope Henry Jeffrey can understand this point, because they keep hammering this over and over again, which is that they really believe that this government, the PPP government, represents and speak to the interests of Indians. I've made the argument that's not the case. If this government was doing that, you would not have an issue when we talk about creating a memorial for the people who were killed in Wisma, for instance, right? Or the people who were driven out. You would not have an argument about having an Indian arrival day, right? You would not have an argument or pushing back on us when we talk about the civil service, right? The army, the police, right? They never want to talk about the army and the police. Those things should reflect the population. So when I use the word memory warriors, that is what I'm saying. Now, I know Henry Jeffrey says, I am proud to wear the badge of a memory warrior. So if you wear the badge of the memory warrior that I define with those characteristics, then you're saying nobody else exists in Ghana. It's all about you. It's all about Africans. And here's the thing to remember, and I don't want to make this personal, but Henry Jeffrey was a fella, who was in charge of, maybe Ravi can correct me on this, of the Coffee Ideological School. He wasn't just a teacher. He was the principal, right? Barnum sent him to study abroad, but when he came back, Hoyt was dismantling, whatever Barnum was building. So Henry Jeffrey he used to hang out with, Clement Rohi, and Chetty Jagan, out of the grace of his goodness, took Henry Jeffrey and gave him a position. And I think for 16 years, he was a member of the PPP cabinet. So for all those years, he has never been concerned about talking about discrimination, imbalance in the army, correcting the curriculum and so on, which he admit, right? But all of a sudden now he has joined the bandwagon of the rest of the memory warriors to say that this is a racist government. This government has to change, and he's pushing this power sharing, notion. So he's forget that history, which he has ignored for so many years, and it has now become a dominant perspective of his. That is what I mean by Henry Jeffrey being a memory warrior. And again, it's the same mindset. I call it a group thing because they all, in a sense, share the same philosophy, right? The exact same philosophy. Government is racist. It was an imposed regime, right? It's discriminating against Africans. Nothing being said about, the fact that, well, there are Africans who may be getting contract and who are doing well, who don't care about this racial division in the past. Nothing about all of that. It's the same language that continues and continues, right? So they are presenting that narrative as if it is the narrative, the only narrative about Guyana that exists. And they beat that to death, right? And again, I'm not trying to make this a personal thing, but that's my impression, and that is what, because he did say, I am proud to be a memory warrior. So if he's a proud memory warrior, then that is how he needs to understand that the people from the other side see him when he champions those things that I just mentioned, the characteristics.
So Ravi, memory warriors, and how come we don't have them among the Indian population?
Well, because we are educated people. You see, one of the ironies that I find, David always refers to himself as being educated. His aunt sent him to school, and Henry, of course, is very much educated. He ran the Ideological Institute for Burnham and all that. So these are all educated men. But I don't think it crossed their mind to look up this term, memory warrior. What did Betoram mean when he said that? The term, and I introduced it into Guyanese political lexicon in 2020, after the election, the attempted rigging and all that. And I'll give you the context of how I introduced it. The point is that the memory warrior was a term introduced by two scholars who studied the post-Soviet republics that are splintered on ethnic lines, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and all of them, and had severe problems in terms of dealing with their ethnic minorities and with their history. So these two scholars, Michael Bernhard and Jan Kubrick, they came out with a book, and where they talked about how history was being used to create different narratives, and they saw a pattern developing, that there were some who they call them memory abnegators. They use the fancy term mnemonics, but I use the word memory. That's what they mean by it. Abnegators, they abnegate. They say, no. We're all one. All of we are one. And therefore, we don't need this kind of particularity in describing ourselves. Well, we know in Guyana who pushes that line about all of we is one, and look down on those who talk about ethnic concerns. So those are the abnegators. The second ones would be the pluralists, the mnemonic pluralists. They concede that yes, there are different narratives. Each group has their own narrative, and they are willing to accept that. And each group must have their narrative and must be allowed to have their narrative. So they are the pluralists. And you have them in Guyana. You have some people like that. And for a while, I thought the WPA was one of those organizations that accepted that, because I'm told WPA was a conglomeration of ethnic and Indian and African interests, ASCRIA and IPRA. But be as it may, I don't think they're there anymore. Then you had a third grouping, which was called memory or mnemonic prospectives. These are people who feel that we should come together to hone a national perspective, a national narrative. And in that national narrative, there are some certain things you have to not play up. You must downplay it. The American narrative about the American dream, for example. Nobody bears to death what happened when the Pilgrim Fathers landed in Plymouth Rock. It's seen as very benign, and they had dinners with Pocahontas and all the whole thing. Young George never told a lie. He said, "Oh, I cut down the cherry tree." So all countries that want to create a unified society have their national narratives. Well, these perspectives work on that, and this is how we, in our ROAR organization, and those of us who came out of ROAR, of course, Beto Ram was a senior leader of ROAR, works from that perspective. So when he writes and talks about the Wisma massacre, as all of us did, or the Wisma pogrom, or the Wisma ethnic cleansing, he does not leave out the Son Chapman, because it's part of that greater tapestry of what happened in our country at a particular time. And you can't have a national narrative if you only have one. But what did the PNC do? After David Granger, then a military scholar, presented a paper about the disturbances, the hurricane of protest, the effects on Africans, he only mentioned what happened to Africans. You understand? And of course, Son Chapman was there. He was replicating what Sidney King wasn't Guyana yet, did in 1962. He wrote a book called Next Witness, where he said that he only mentioned all of the things that happened to Africans at that time, as if nothing had happened to Indians also. So David Granger was following in that tradition. And after 2003, the following year, the PNC picked that up, and they started to commemorate the Son Chapman sinking. Every single year, they wrote about that. And finally, they moved that commemoration from Huradai out into the Demerara River and moved it to Linden, the place where 3,000 Indian men, women, and children were driven out. 220 houses were razed, women were raped, all manner of atrocities, not even a mention of them in all of this. And to this year, you come July 6th, they will commemorate that every year. Their local chairman, Sharma Solomon, will only talk about his Son Chapman. The PNC will talk about it. And irony of ironies, David Hines was a member of a group put together by Alicia Trotz that examined the pain and hurt of those that fled. And the man has never written about it, never mentioned it. Even Trotz has refused to give up those findings that she has written about, those interviews with those people who were suffering in the 2008 when they did their new survey. The point I want to make is that these memory warriors, as Beto said earlier, and I said from 2020, and I gave chapter and verse as to what it is. And this is the point that Henry misses and David misses, and I don't think they miss it. They deliberately misrepresent them. They try to equate what we're doing because we are using history, which is to rectify the history, but our rectification of history is not one-sided. When we write, we always talk what happened also on the other side. You can't have a national narrative. So what these two gentlemen, and I'll use the term rather loosely here, what these two gentlemen are doing is that they are, as Beto said, they are merely saying that Guyana only belong, that the Caribbean in general and Guyana in particular only belongs to one particular race, and that is the African race. And there's no place for Indian. And to the extent that it can be driven out, all well and good. When, and I wrote that first article and mentioned memory warriors in 2020 September, after David in Buxton talking to his people in very animated terms, said, undermine them, undermine this government. And you understand that and use a very African term that what Beniba said, quasi take notice, meaning what he says, others must take notice. So as I pointed out in that letter to the press, David knew exactly what he's saying. He said undermine it when he's using it in a village that was known for rebellion, when he's using it in a very politically charged atmosphere in September of 2020. They're using a kind of language which is Burnham's esoteric language that Burnham he really practiced and was perfect at it, to send signals without actually saying go out and chop off their heads, because there are people then who would read it. You get me, not to get too fancy philosophically, but there's a big school of philosophy that talks about words, of words being action words, words themselves got action. J.L. Austin talks about that. So when you use certain words, it's just like performing the action, because that's the effect that it will have on the listener. It's called the elocutionary effect. The locutionary effect is simply the words. Hey, undermine them. But what is the effect on the listener? What was the effect on David's audience? We found out a bit later in Mon Repos what the language meant. When they were given, to use Burnham's terms, a rather condign beating, another condign beating in Mon Repos there. Of course, there was the customary looting, but that's neither here nor there. The point I want to make is that memory warrior is a precise term of art, and David and Henry should bone up on it and understand what they're talking before they jump in and use terms that they have absolutely no understanding of. And then I think we can then have a discussion and a discourse where we're talking to each other, not at each other as they seem to want to do.
Dr. Ramra, any final points before we close up?
Yeah, I'm sure, David likes to replay some of what we say, but I hope he replays some of the things we said here today. And I just want David to know that I see him also as a memory warrior, not just Henry Jeffrey. But again, the thing is, if you want to be, honest about, the politics that define ourselves, that's something you need to recognize, that there's also the other side, the other narrative that has to be considered. And it bears repetition that the whole notion of what Tacoma said about the reference to the disciplinary forces, what Kadaki has said about Coolies, or what the caller had said about, decapitating the heads of people, those elements of the discussion seems to be wished aside. It's now a memory warrior attempt to protect the person who was saying those things without recognizing what they have done. And I do want to say, I did meet with, Sharma Solomon, the mayor of Linden, and we talk about the issue that Rafi had raised about, if you're going to have your commemoration of the Son Chapman, where 43 people were killed in that river launch, why ignore the fact that in May 24, 25th, 26th, there was a tremendous trauma brought upon a community that has been exercised. And I raised the same issue with Norton. They both said to me that, well, we will do it, but we don't want to use the word massacre. So I said, okay, if you don't want to use the word massacre, because we think of massacre, that's the word that Chetty had used, by the way. If we think of a lot of people being killed and so on, then okay, then I think the word ethnic cleansing, Indians were cleansed from that area. That to me would be an appropriate word. So that's a word that they should consider using. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in July when they have that, commemoration for the victims of the Son Chapman. So we have talked a lot here about, what that whole notion of memory warriors mean, the whole notion of name calling or assigning names to people. And what it comes down to, and I always say, it means that we have to have that communication going, right? And we have been doing that. We are willing to engage any others who are willing, to take that move, and so we can have that discussion, because we all have to recognize that we have a narrative, and there's a narrative of the others. We don't even hear about the narrative of the Amerindians so much. And I think we all, at the end of the day, have to recognize that there ought to be a national narrative where we are all part of that discussion, so we can address the concerns that we all have. It can't be a one-sided kind of discussion. And I'll leave it at that.
Interrogating Coolies and Negroes and memory warriors. Any final points, Ravi, before we close out?
Yeah, I would like to repeat that we want to commend our approach of being memory prospectives rather than memory warriors. Whether we like it or not, the modern state system, which was founded in 1648 after the Treaty of Westphalia, still exists, and it's not going to disappear. Therefore, there is a state that is there, the state called Guyana. That state confirms something called citizenship on all of us. So whatever rights that state confers, all of us have an equal right to those rights. So that's the whole notion of us being Guyanese. But we also are bearers of culture. We are bearers of culture, ineluctably so, right? To act, to do, to know is to have something in your head, which, to be blunt about it at the widest level, is what culture is all about, your way of life. And that culture is encapsulated in narratives. And that is why we have to be careful with our narratives, because ordinary people are not going to dissect and interrogate these things. They simply get what are called heuristics. They break down things into very simple 1, 2, 3 point, and that's how they understand life. And when these memory warriors give their one-sided narrative, I listen to some of the callers sometimes that call into their programs. And when I listen to them, my heart sinks for where is our Guyana going if this is how we're going to talk. That one caller was extreme, and the fellow is of Guyanese descent from Georgia. I hope the police is looking him out, because I went to the guy's Facebook page, and he's in Georgia doing farming, and he has a whole blog, and I saw him being in touch with Mr. U.C. Quayana, who is also in Georgia and all that. So the fellow was talking what he had listened. He was reacting to it. That was his reaction to what a bolt of lightning didn't drop from the sky and he suddenly say, behead these people. He's living in Georgia. How did he get all this information as to why to take that extreme position? And it is because of these memory warriors. And if we don't want another conflagration in Guyana, then this better sees, and we hope that the government and the authorities, but more importantly, these individuals themselves will take cognizance of what they're doing and become more positive, create a narrative, a national narrative. I did not know Henry very well. I first met him in person. I was invited to, after Chetty won the 1992 elections, I was invited at Empire Cinema his speech from the stage there. That was his first gathering. And this chap behind me, I introduced himself. He was Henry Jeffrey. And then I realized Henry at some level was going to be working with the PPP. And sometime later, Henry invited me to a meeting. I believe it was at the Georgetown Club, to meet an individual who was going to talk about Guyana needing a national narrative. So Henry obviously thought I could contribute to such a project. It was years ago. The guy left the country, was some white fella entered the country. Never heard back about it again. So I'm very saddened that there was a time when Henry was thinking about the national narrative, but here he is being driven. And I use the word driven. Hopefully he hasn't just done this out of malice to become a memory warrior, which can lead to big trouble. That's it for me.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your erudite contribution tonight on this very important subject and topic. And again,
erudite, is that a good word or
and let me thank the viewers and listeners for joining us tonight. Good night. Goodbye.